So hi, I am Nick Stone and I am going to be your teacher person today. I see that we have friends here from all over the place. There's friends here from Wales. I see New Jersey, Illinois. Hello friends there. Hello friends in California, Michigan, Florida, Ohio, Manitoba, Canada. I am so excited that you guys are here today to listen to me talk about my writing process. So this is how this is going to go. I am going to talk for a few minutes about my own personal writing process. I have what I think is the greatest job in the world. I write books for a living. I write stories, and I'm typically writing stories aimed at young people. So 12 to 18, really 8 to 18. Some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today I'll be using examples from books that I wrote that are aimed at 8 to 14-year-olds, and they are about a very special character from a very special superhero universe. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to talk today about a mnemonic that I use. A mnemonic is a word or phrase that you use to remember a different set of words or phrases. So, for example, when I was in elementary school, we learned the sentence, "My very excellent mother just served us 9 pizzas," in order to learn the planets in the solar system. That has changed because Pluto, unfortunately, is no longer considered a planet. So now we are, sorry guys, Siri just decided she was going to talk to me. Yes, so now that Pluto's not a planet anymore, that has changed. But another mnemonic is PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, which is something that we use to remember the order of operations in math. So as I am talking about my personal mnemonic, I'll tell you what it is in just a second. Um, you can send questions in as I'm talking, and I will answer them as we go along. There's a question, it looks like a little thought bubble with a question mark in it up at the top right-hand side of your screen. So if you have questions while I'm giving the presentation and while I'm telling you about my process, feel free to pop them in there, and somebody will make sure that they get to me. All right, let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So the mnemonic that I use for my writing process, as a person who writes books, it's important for me to do it in a way that makes sense. Writing a book is something that takes a decent amount of time and involves quite a few words. The average book I write, I think the shortest book I've ever written was 32,000 words. And those words, of course, are broken down into chapters. And with all of that together, thinking about writing 32,000 words to make a story, I have to have a process that I follow in order for me to do this over and over and over again. So the mnemonic, the sentence that I use to remember my own process is, "I only eat raspberries." I'll say it again. "I only eat raspberries." Now, each of these words stands for a different part of the process. We'll start with the letter I. So I is for inspiration. This is the part of the process when I get an idea. For me, ideas are everywhere. Like there's nowhere that I look or turn that I can't find something that I would be interested in writing about. A really good example of this, I was at a high school in Iowa City, Iowa. This was in 2018. And while I was there, I was doing visits with students all day long. So I was there from first period through seventh period. Class after class of kids would come into the library and I would get to talk to them. Well, in the middle of the day, the power went out. I wound up having lunch with the principal shortly after the power went out, and the principal let it slip that while the power was out, all of the emergency systems were down. So they couldn't call any buses. They couldn't call any kind of emergency services. There was no way for them to connect with the outside world. Additionally, this was a school that had magnetic doors that locked electrically, right? So with the power out, you couldn't open the doors. So basically, there were all of these students that were more or less stuck inside the school without knowing it. And while I was there and this is going on, I thought to myself, this would be a really cool setting for a book. What would happen if a bunch of kids were trapped inside a school during the school day and they couldn't get out? Once I have an idea, I move into the O part of the process. So O, for me, is the most important part, and it's organization. When I am organizing, a story, when I'm organizing a book, when I'm organizing any kind of narrative, anything, what I like to do is get me one of these. So this is a composition notebook. I have them literally all around my office. I'm currently sitting on the floor. There's a couch in my office, a pink couch, and I'm sitting on the floor in front of that couch. And these things are all around me because once I have an idea, I need to think more about it and I need to like process it out and I need to think about like things that are attached to that idea. So when I have this composition notebook, what winds up going in here is everything from character names, character traits, plot points. So things that are going to happen in the book, things like lines of dialogue. So like if I'm sitting in my car and like I get this witty line in my head that a character is going to say in a book, I will write that down in my notebook. I also tend to write a summary. So like what I'll do is with this notebook, like if you were to flip through this notebook, and I am going to actually show you some of the stuff that's in here, you will see sometimes a paragraph, like you'll see a page with a paragraph on it. And that paragraph is typically the summary of an entire story. So I'm going to read you one of these summaries. So here we go. So this is the summary of a book that I've written on this page. With the first two phases of Panther training under her vibranium-lined utility belt, Princess Shuri is feeling confident. That is until the night she's jolted out of sleep by the Queen. Someone attempted to break into the palace and succeeded, then managed to get away. The guards claim it was a person possessed of superhuman speed and strength, and when the security footage is rolled back, Shuri can see that they're right. But there's also something eerily familiar about the intruder, even though he's in a black suit with a white spider on the chest. Mystery interloper pulls off 3 additional nights of crime sprees, and Princess Shuri takes matters into her own hands. What she discovers, I'm not going to tell you the spoiler, even though it's here in the summary. Thus, Shuri and her best friend embark on a hunt that will take them to parts of Wakanda neither has ever seen before. And when a brown-skinned kid, and when another kid in another spoiler I'm not going to say, shows up to the palace claiming he knows what's going on, Shuri and Kamara take him up regarding his health. Yeah, and then I'm not going to read the last sentence because it's also a spoiler. So what I just did was I read you the summary of a book that comes out in November. It hasn't even announced yet, so you all should feel very special. Once I have this summary, the most important thing for me to do next in this organization phase is to take the pieces of information that I've pulled together. Sometimes it's just like this. This is a jotted list of things that need to happen in the book. Like there's a fight scene that needs to happen, a person feeling like an outsider, 2 characters creating something together, she's initially told to stay out of it. So like all of these things are things that need to happen in order for my story to make sense. For me, this part of the process, the organization process, can take weeks. It can take months. It just depends on how quickly the pieces of the story come together in my mind. Also, a part of this organization process, I take all of these different plot points and these different things that I need to happen in the book, and I organize them in an outline. So I am a writer who cannot write without an outline. I need to know, like before I start a book, I need to know how it's going to end. And I also need to know what's going to happen in the middle, right? So the idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end, those are one of the first 3 things that I write down in this notebook. While I am trying to figure out how to put things in order, and I'm creating my outline, I'm also thinking about logic, right? And I'm thinking about making sure that things aren't happening out of nowhere. So my outline for this book is actually right here. So this is how I started the outline. I write like a chart, right? And so in the chart, I will write on the left-hand margin, there's like the chapter number or whatever, like there's this thing called mission, because in these books, there are these things called mission logs. And then I'll have the numbers of the chapters. And then alongside that is like what happens in each chapter. And once I do all that, I can move into the next phase. But before we get to that, I'm going to answer a few of these questions. So one of the questions is, how did I know writing stories was my passion? I didn't actually know that writing stories was my passion until I was a little bit older. I was 27 when I first decided I wanted to try and be a writer. And I'd been a reader for a long time, and I'd loved the idea of story. I'd loved that story was this thing where like sometimes it's unpredictable, but you're getting to go on this journey without actually having to leave your house. I also loved the idea of getting to put myself into the shoes of a person who is different from me, learning from their experiences, figuring out what makes them tick. And then with that, you kind of take things into yourself and you change. Like over the course of reading stories, so many of my ideas expanded, and so many of the things that I thought I could do or thought that I wanted to do, those things would expand as well. So it took me a while to actually get started. But once I did, like, it is the coolest thing in the world to have this as a job, right? To get to tell these stories as a job. One of the most important things about the storytelling process to me is figuring out what and who I'm going to write about. This also goes into the organization piece. Character is a super important part of writing story. For me, character is everything. If I don't have a thing that if I don't have a person at the center of a story, I don't really have a story. So with this passion for writing, and this idea of character being at the center, what I discovered in my mid-20s was that part of the reason it was taking me so long to get into storytelling is because I rarely saw characters who looked like me in the books that I read when I was young. My favorite book series as a kid was this book series called Encyclopedia Brown. And they were these books about this little white boy who would help solve mysteries in his neighborhood for like a nickel. So like if you had a mystery that needed to be solved or some problem that needed to be solved, you could bring Encyclopedia Brown like a nickel or a dime, and he would solve your mystery for you. And there was something very cool to me about a character who saw things that other people didn't notice and was able to put those things together in a way that would solve a problem. However, Encyclopedia Brown didn't look like me. So now when I'm going through this process and I'm thinking about, okay, what do I need to put in this book? How do I need to organize things? And who do I need this book to be about? That is a super important part of the organization piece, because I want to make sure that I am not only representing myself, but also representing kids who are like me. So along the lines of character development with this organization stage, I actually have a template that I fill out. Before I fill it out, it's like 2 pages long in Microsoft Word, and it's single space. So it's just question after question after question. So there's questions like, what's the character's favorite color? What's the character's biggest fear? How does the character start the story? Like how do they think when they're starting the story, and how do they think when they're ending the story? What's the thing that the character is going to have to fight for in the story? Through all of that organization, I get to know my character so that when the character is on the page, the character reads as a person. There are things on that list of character questions that I don't even use in the story, but it helps me to get to know who I'm writing about. So once I've got the character, once I've figured out like loosely what the plot is going to be, once I kind of know like what direction I'm going to head in the story, I can move into the E. So the EAT part of the mnemonic, the E, is for execution. Execution is all about your first draft. So when I am writing a first draft of a story, I'm the writer who does not look back over what I'm doing. Like I just try to start and I just go straight through until I get to the end of the first draft. For me, that's been a very liberating thing, right? Like I interact with a lot of young writers who are afraid to write because they're afraid of getting it wrong, of not nailing it on the first try. And I can tell you, as a published author, you don't nail it on the first try. I don't even nail it on the first try. And my 7th book just came out. There's a question in here about what it's like to be published. This is from Mrs. Majdi's 4th grade class. How did it feel when you were first published? It felt amazing, but it was also very scary, right? So as I'm drafting a book and I'm thinking about the fact that this book is eventually going to be read by people, that's it makes that process very scary, the execution process very scary. However, I know that the first draft is not actually supposed to be good. All of you out there that want to tell stories, please, if you get nothing else from me on this field trip today, understand that you are never going to nail your story on the first try. It is just not a thing that happens, and it shouldn't happen. Your first try is like, I like to use the analogy of clay, right? People who make pottery, you have to actually mix the ingredients to make the clay before you can put the clay on that like spinny wheel and like start spinning the wheel and making the pot. So your first draft is really about getting the clay mixed. So when I'm writing a first draft, Lengthwise, I try to write a chapter a day when I'm working on a book. I am not a writer who writes every day. There are times when I am just conceptualizing or like brainstorming or trying to figure out what's happening in a story. So I will take blocks of time to just do the organization phase where I'm trying to figure out what happens. I'm trying to figure out why it happens. I'm trying to make sure that all of the pieces are going to be in place in order for me to draft the story. And then once I get into the drafting part, I'll write typically a chapter a day, depending on what else is going on. I think I tend to write, it's anywhere between 1,800 and 2,500 words per day. So depending on the book will determine the length of the chapters for me. So if I'm writing a book like this one, these chapters were about 1,800 words each. They're about 6 pages each. So once I've written that 6 pages for the day, I stop writing for the day. And that's a thing that actually helps me to make sure I'm doing other things in life. So like while you are executing your writing, I personally think it's important to continue like living, right? Because there are so many things that you're going to encounter in the world that will impact your draft in a positive way. So another question we have here is Miss Bruno's class wants to know what was my inspiration to become a writer in the first place, and when did I realize my career would be an author? So part of the thing that inspired me to become a writer in the first place is similar to what I said, similar to my answer to the previous question. It was the fact that I didn't really see stories about me. That was my biggest inspiration to become a writer, because I got to a point where I realized that if I wasn't seeing stories about myself, I should be the one to write them. If I wasn't seeing stories about kids like my sons, I have 2 sons. I have a 3rd grade son and a pre-K son. So they are 4 and 8 years old, and I wasn't seeing many stories about them either. So it was up to me to write them. Those are the things that kind of drive me still to this day. I like telling the stories that I don't think have been told. Even the stories, though, that have been told, they aren't told the way that I would tell it, right? So one of the most important things to remember as a writer, there really are no new stories, right? There are only new ways of telling them. I think I read there are either like 7 or 9 typical story types that all follow, and each one follows kind of the same trajectory. There's like the hero's journey, there's the coming of age narrative. There are all of these types of stories, but every story that you read is going to fall into one of those categories. What makes your story unique is how you tell it. Because as a writer, there are going to be experiences, ideas, thoughts, perspectives that you bring to a story that nobody else has. So with that, while you are executing and letting yourself kind of be your best self on the page, I think that it's important to recognize that even though your first draft isn't the best thing in the world, it's still good because it's coming from you and nobody else can put out what you can put out. After the organization piece, a note, because the other thing is that after the execution piece, so organization and execution can be flipped, right? So I have friends who don't outline their stories. For them, the acronym would be, I eat only raspberries. And that's perfectly okay too. I have friends who they will get an idea and then they immediately start writing a draft. Totally fine. If that's the way that your brain works, absolutely go for it. And then after you have a draft, then you have to go back in and organize, right? So either you organize and then you write a draft, or you have a draft and then you go back and you organize. But both of those things are necessary before you get to the raspberries. And the raspberries are all about revision. I will be completely honest with you all. This is my least favorite part of the process. I do not like revising my stories. I don't like sitting down and editing and picking things apart and like having to read through and see where there are plot holes and see where there are times where I will write a book. This is totally a secret, so don't tell anybody. I will write a book and halfway through the book, the characters' names will change. And it'll be like, wait, I thought this character was Josephine, but now her name is Tabitha. And it's confusing, obviously, right? So like, this is the reason that you have to revise. For me, my revision process also happens in the notebook. Depending on the story, I often write out something that looks like this. This is a revision chart. So what you see on this chart, there are different sections here. And in these sections, there's a chapter. The chapter is on this line. Plot, what happens in the chapter goes here. what's happening with the main character goes here, and then the changes that I need to make go here. So as I'm reading through, I will make notes about these different things that need to happen in these chapters as I'm revising, right? And then I go back in and I do the actual revision. So I will comb through the text. At this point, I'm not trying to look for like spelling errors or grammar errors. I'm looking for things like plot holes, like I mentioned. I'm looking for things like places where the story doesn't make sense. I'm looking for places where something is just too easy, right? Like there are things, sometimes you read a book and something will happen in the book and it's like, but the character actually worked for that to happen, or is that just the author deciding that that's what's going to happen next? There's this really cool Latin phrase for that. It's called "deus ex machina," which translates to God from the machine. But what that basically means is like the author decided that this was what was going to happen, so this is what happens, but it doesn't necessarily add up or line up in the text. So once you revise, the coolest thing about getting through a revision is that you get to like breathe this sigh of relief that you've made your story better. I'm going to answer another question here in the chat. Who inspired me to be an author? And this is from Mrs. Yaz's 4th and 5th graders. Hello, Mrs. Yaz's 4th and 5th graders. I'm so glad that you are here with me today. That's a really good question. I will tell you, I can't really tell you who inspired me to be an author, but I can tell you who inspires me to continue being an author. I have a really good friend named Jason Reynolds. Jason Reynolds he's a fellow author. He started publishing books long before I did, but like he kind of reemerged in the year 2014, I believe. And right after I sold my first book, I sent this man, Jason Reynolds, an email and I asked him if he would be my friend. And he said yes. The reason that Jason inspires me is because he's an African-American man. And he was the first person whose books I read where the characters sounded like the kids in my neighborhood. So reading a book written by a person who looked like me, who was writing characters who not only looked like me, but also sounded like me, it empowered me to write similar things. A New Jersey class is asking if I've ever started writing a story and then stopped because I didn't like it. No, I have though written a whole story. I've gone through the whole I only eat raspberries process. I got the idea. It was about a girl who glowed in the dark. That was like the spark of an idea, was the idea of this girl's hands. I don't know, just in my head, I got this image of a girl whose hands would spark when she got upset. And so that spiraled into this idea that she would glow in the dark also if she got upset. And that moved into the organization phase where I decided that I was going to tell this whole story about this girl who glows in the dark, who is prophesied to defeat darkness. I wrote an outline. I wrote an entire draft. I revised it like 5 times and it's never been published. It's actually, I put it last summer at the start of the pandemic. I put it on Wattpad because it's one of those things where looking back over something that I created a long time ago that I don't think will probably ever be published in this format, it helps me to see, it's important to know where you came from so that you can see how far you've come, which also gives you the juice to keep going, right? So while I haven't really stopped a book or a story because I didn't like what was happening or I didn't like the writing, I will say that there are definitely things that I've started and finished that will probably never see the light of day. So I'm going to keep answering questions now. And after this Q&A, we're going to do a selfie. So I forgot to mention that at the beginning. My bad, guys. After we do this Q&A, actually, no, I think we're supposed to do the selfie now, right? I think we're supposed to do the selfie now. So we're going to run over one more time what the mnemonic is. I only eat raspberries. Inspiration, organization, execution, revision, or I eat only raspberries. Inspiration, execution, organization, and revision. This is the way that I make my books into books or make my stories into things that are publishable. And I think that you could use it too. So now we're going to do our selfie. I'm going to answer your questions in just a moment, but I'm going to hold up my books and you all are going to get to take a picture with me. And if you do happen to post it on Instagram or Twitter, feel free to tag me. If you do it on Instagram, I am at Nick Stone. If you do it on Twitter, I am at GetNicked. That's GetNicked. I couldn't get the Nick Stone handle because somebody else has it and they won't give it to me. Can you believe that? So let's do our selfie. So gather in front of the screen in your classroom. And when you share this on Twitter, use the hashtag FlipGridForAll, and then you can tag me, GetNicked. You can tag Flipgrid, and you can tag Scholastic. So I'm going to hold up these two books. This is the one that I'm, thinking and talking about a little bit today. So this is Shuri, The Vanish. That revision thing that I just held up, that revision chart, was for this book. And then this is the book that came before it. This is the first Shuri book. So I'm going to hold these up, and I'm going to count down from 5, and you guys will be able to take your selfie. We're going to have probably like 20 seconds to do this. So everybody get ready. 5, 4, 3, 2, cheese. I feel like we need background music. Changing my pose. Okay. Hopefully you all got your selfies. Now, my favorite part of things like this is when I get to answer more questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here and I'm going to answer some of the questions that are here that aren't necessarily related to process. So one of the first questions here is from Anya. Hi, Anya. Anya's question is, how do I stay motivated to write? I really love writing. So it's actually not that hard for me to stay motivated. I love the process of storytelling. I love the process of getting to the end is my favorite thing about storytelling. I have a lot of tattoos, friends, but one of my favorite ones is this one here on my wrist. It says relentless. And the reason I have relentless tattooed on my wrist is because it's my reminder to not quit. As I mentioned in a previous answer, I tend to I don't like not finishing projects, even if they're not going to be published. So the motivation for me is finishing a lot of the time. A question from Dory, how many drafts on average do you write? Dory, the interesting thing here is there really is no average. I have done 16 drafts of a thing. I've done 3 drafts of a thing. It honestly just depends on the project. With this Shuri novel, I think there were 4 drafts. With this one, with this one, I think there were 5 drafts. With this one, there were 3. I have had one instance of a book that only had 2 drafts. I had a book come out at the end of September 2020 called Dear Justice. And that book, I turned in a first draft and I didn't really have to make any changes. That's the first and last time I think that will ever happen. And the only reason I think it happened with that book is because it was such a hard book to write. I was so focused and so in the zone with it, it just kind of flowed out. I am thankful for that experience because I'm pretty sure it's never going to happen again. What inspires the storylines from my books? And do I feel a personal connection to the characters I write about? As I mentioned, inspiration can come from anywhere for me. A lot of the time, though, I will say that I write about things that bother me. Even with these Marvel books, because I've held them up 3 times now. I do write novels for Marvel Comics. And even with these books, there's something in the book that was rooted in something that bothers me. In the first book, it's climate change. And then the second book, it's the idea of kids going missing and nobody looking for them, which sounds really scary and terrible, but I think I handle it pretty well in the second book. So with the characters, I do. I don't think I've ever written a character that I don't feel a personal connection to. And I do think it's important to feel a personal connection to your characters, because if you don't, who will, right? If I'm writing a story and I don't feel connected to the character, I think it's kind of impossible for me to be writing a character that anybody else will feel connected to. I feel the same way about emotion. So if I'm writing a book that makes me super emotional, I know that it's going to make the reader emotional. If I'm writing a book and there are sad things happening and I don't feel anything, chances are I'm not writing it well enough for a reader to feel anything either. So when it comes to personal connection and feeling, and like if I write a line and I don't laugh, you're probably not going to laugh. Just so write like a reader and read like a writer. So as you're writing different things, think about yourself also as a reader, because as you write and you're reading kind of as you write, there is this thing where you recognize like, okay, well, this isn't going to work. This didn't make me laugh, so I need to change the joke. This here is a really sad scene, but I don't feel anything, which probably means that I'm not writing it very well. What suggestions do I have for students who do not like to write and or can never think of anything to write about? Write what is around you is my first suggestion. When I was in high school, I had a teacher named Mr. Weeks. In Mr. Weeks' class, I was lucky enough to have him for 2 years in a row. I had him for 10th grade and 11th grade English. And twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we would open class by free writing. So what do I mean by free writing? We would sit down, we had notebooks specifically for free writing. And for the first 5 to 7 minutes of class, we would just write whatever, like whatever came to mind, you would write. In that free writing, you will find that there are so many things going on in your head that you could totally turn into a story. You could totally turn into something that you do want to write about. I do find that a lot of kids, a lot of students, scholars who don't like to write, they don't like to write because they think they're going to get it wrong. And I think a lot of that fear of getting it wrong has to do with our kind of heavy focus on grammatical correctness. Now, what I will say, you do have to know the rules of grammar in order to break them effectively. I'm going to say that again. You do need to know the rules of English grammar in order to break them effectively. However, the rules do change. I remember when I was in school, there was this thing called a run-on sentence. I found out recently that those are now called fused sentences. So the language that we use to talk about language changes over time, which means that language itself is changing over time. So you just have to give yourself the space to like not get things perfect. I think that's the main piece of advice I would give to people who are like, I don't know what to write about. Write about what's around you. Write about what you're feeling. Write about what you're thinking. Pick a word or a color and write something about that. Everywhere around you, there is stuff that you can write about. And when you start writing about it, it'll spin out into other things and you'll get this like really cool thing that you weren't expecting. That's one of my favorite things about writing is that I can be writing something and stuff will start to come out and I have no idea where it came from, but it makes things really cool. Okay, so Mrs. Hilger's class, I hope I said that right, Mrs. Hilger. Do you ever let friends or family members read your books during the writing process before the book is done? Always. Not necessarily friends or family members. It depends. Sometimes it's friends or family members, but honestly, friends and family members aren't really going to give me a non-biased opinion on what I'm doing for the most part. I find that when I do let my friends or family members, I do have writer friends that I will absolutely get a non-biased opinion. But typically when it's friends reading, they're like, this is the best thing ever, which is great for my ego. Don't get me wrong. However, it's not the greatest thing for my writing. Like, when I am writing a book before the book is done and before it gets published, I definitely enlist the assistance of people who are like the characters in the book. For instance, in these books, the Shuri books, when I was writing these books, I had a bunch of people reading them. I had a bunch of people reading passages because the thing about Shuri, so Shuri is the little sister of the Black Panther, right? She's the smartest person on earth. She's smarter than Tony Stark. Even Tony Stark has said this. And she's smarter than Bruce Banner. She's smarter than all of these people. She's like this technology guru. She's really great with science and math. And so when I'm writing these books, I had to consult a person who's an expert in thermodynamics. I had to consult a physicist. I had to consult somebody who understands electromagnetism. I had to consult somebody to understand the science of a hovercraft, right? Like there are so many different things that we see in science fiction and fantasy books. And because these are science fiction, more science fiction, they're like a little bit of both. But because there's so much science in it, even fake science, I had to consult real scientists, right? So I have a book about softball that comes out later this year. And I had a friend of mine was on a team that won the Little League World Series of softball when she was younger. So she read that book for me while it was in process. The books that I write about boys, for instance, I'll have boys read those books. The most important thing to me is authenticity, right? So even if I'm writing a character who isn't exactly like me, which really is all of my characters, because at no point have I written an autobiography. I have people who are like that character read the book just so that they can make sure that I'm not getting anything wrong. And I think that that's a really important thing, especially when you're writing about when you're representing people who are different from you. All right, you got time for one more question here. And I am going to take Miss Laurie's class's question. Do I have any hobbies besides writing? I do. I love reading. I mean, a lot of people would lump those two together, but I love to read. And I also love things like indoor rock climbing. I love to paint. And I love doing fun things with my kids. Thanks for joining us today. I'm glad that you guys were here. And I hope that you got something out of this whole thing. Have a good afternoon.